Hi, good evening. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and thank you for that kind introduction. So today I'm going to be sharing the story of Clifford Ricker. He's a pioneer in architectural education, and he saw the importance of building construction to his students, to the architecture profession, to public safety, and in creating an American architecture. When he taught, there were few standards in education, yet his focus in building construction was quite impactful as an educator, and he helped shape the architecture profession of the 19th century. So let's start by learning something about Ricker. Here he is, an image of him in his later years. He was one of the early educators in university architectural education in the United States. His role at the University of Illinois began in 1873, and when he retired in 1916, he had served as head of the School of Architecture for 37 years, the dean of the College of Engineering for 27 years, and the chair of the Illinois State Board of Examiners of Architects for 17 years. So while leading the school, it is estimated that he educated a quarter of all architecture students in the United States at the time, and it should be noted that the University of Illinois was the only architecture school outside of the East Coast until the 1890s. Despite all of his accomplishments, he remains relatively unknown and unappreciated nationally. Ricker was born and raised in Maine in a farming community. We have images of his house. He had some but limited access to education. He noted himself that he had few books to read and none to borrow as a child. He attended the family farm. He worked at the family mill. He learned both in school and on his own. This habit of studying at night and educating himself allowed him to gain the subjects he needed to go to a university, such as Latin, botany, and geology. He furthered his skills by learning to work in wood, which led to a position in at a building making piano cases. He performed carpentry for building construction, and then he co-owned a wagon and blacksmith shop. Ricker described the latter as hard but practical work, fixing wagons, carriages, and farm tools in La Harpe, Illinois. So we don't know how he got from Maine to La Harpe, but he ended up in La Harpe, Illinois. In 1869, he met a student from the Illinois Industrial University, which we know is the precursor to University of Illinois. He heard of the student's experiences and soon sold his shares to the wagon shop and left for Champaign. It was an education that he had long sought. Ricker arrived at the Illinois Industrial University at midnight on July 2nd, 1870, at the age of 26. Unbeknownst to him, the Champaign and Urbana area would be the home for the rest of his life. As many of you are aware, in 1870, Champaign County and Illinois were still growing. After periods of interruption, the Illinois Central Railroad completed approximately 700 miles of tracks in 1856, and by 1860, Chicago was the eastern terminus for several major rail lines. The publication Illinois Farmer proclaimed in 1864 that Champaign is on the move, with new buildings springing up, facilities for making money, and a place to start family, which was not true of all Illinois rural towns at the time. The state was transforming, aided by industry, technology, and infrastructure. When Ricker arrived on campus, there was one building, the newly formed campus, and this was the old university building shown here. The Illinois Industrial University had been funded by the 1862 Morrill Act, as we know, and opened with 50 students in 1868. The Morrill Act sought to promote industrial education in engineering and agriculture, though John Milton Gregory, the first university regent, intended to combine such education with arts and architecture. A course of architecture and fine arts was placed within the Polytechnic department with engineering and mining. This image is from the course catalog, and by 1870, when Ricker joined the campus, the student population had tripled. Ricker described his classmates as mature, but having insufficient educational preparation, but earnest. After consideration of both his interest in civil engineering and his trade experience in building construction, Ricker chose a course in architecture. The education program was only loosely conceived when he arrived. The university catalogs reflect this experience, with the course in 1968 being in the Department of Mechanical Science, was not mentioned at all in 1869, and a mere paragraph in 1870. So that's the entire description of the program of architecture in 1870. This lack of curricula definition mirrored the newness of architectural education in the United States. The first continuous architectural university program was at Institute in Massachusetts, you may have heard of, in 1865. Illinois was next in 1868, and Cornell was third in 1871. Apprenticeships were the current form of education, but to assist with the demands placed on practicing architects, It was essential to train those in the profession to think independently. In 1869, the American Institute of Architects began a committee to explore the possibility of a grand central school of architecture modeled after the important schools in Europe, like the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. As MIT William Ware described at the time, but what we need is not so much draftsmen, but real assistants, young men with enough knowledge and practice of design to relieve us of some of our own labor. This training could only come from a university education. However, when Ricker was a student at the university, that training was not yet defined. Though him being an autodidact, he was able certainly to make his own way. Mirroring the civil engineering curriculum for several years, he studied math, he studied German and mechanics, and eventually got to freehand drawing and architectural drawing methods. Harold Hansen was considered the first architectural faculty member for the School of Architecture, and with his hiring, there was a fuller development of the curriculum. So we're lucky to have a lot of documents that still exist. This is a drawing from 1862 of one of Ricker's design projects. This is a corn exchange building designed by Ricker as a student. Ricker's work was likely completed under Hansen. This is also a Ricker project, and this is the villa, Ricker's villa, and it was what we think is designed in the winter term of 1872. So due to Ricker's self-initiative and study, he would have been able to complete his degree requirements, in the spring of 1872. So remember, he joined in the winter of 1870, so he would have gotten out within 2 years. However, the Great Chicago Fire occurred in October 1871 and interrupted his studies. Ricker accompanied the University Corps cadets to Chicago, whose orders from the governor were to prevent looting. These cadets returned to Champaign after a few days, but Ricker saw some opportunities. And so in the spring and summer of 1872, Ricker returned to Chicago to work for architect John W. Roberts on a few projects, and he mentions this project by name, and so we're able to have a rendering of that. So besides gaining architectural office experience, Ricker reflected on the vast need for building in Chicago. It was indeed a great practical training, perhaps not equal since the burning of Rome, he said. Returning to the campus in fall of 1872, Ricker found that his instructor, Hansen, had too relocated to Chicago, and there was no architectural instructor. University Regent Gregory asked Ricker to become the instructor for the program. Ricker was not only to teach his classmates the architectural curriculum, but to complete his own work simultaneously. So Ricker's career as an architectural educator had begun. In March 12, 1873, the Board of Trustees awarded N. Clifford Ricker his certificate of scholarship for a full course of architecture, making him the first within the United States to receive an architectural university degree, with the graduates from MIT and Cornell coming just 3 months later in June, and they're still mad about it. Gregory noted Ricker's practical and previous mechanical or hands-on experience, and the time spent in building construction in his wagon shop gave Ricker valuable insights into what knowledge was needed for an architectural education. However, Ricker was asked to visit Europe to increase his own architectural knowledge and to observe architectural education institutions. So Ricker and Gregory sailed through Europe in March of 1873, and the Bau Academy in Berlin was his first destination. And this choice appears to be influenced by Ricker's coursework with Hansen, as Hansen had studied there. Other stops included Vienna, Prague, Dresden, Paris, Glasgow, and London. And so, amazingly, these are hand sketches from that 1873 trip that were done on trace paper that still exist in the archive. And so these are just a sampling of those sketches. It's amazing to have something so ephemeral with us. So during that trip to Vienna, Ricker attended the 1873 World's Fair, where he noted the technical education through shop practices as exhibited by Russia. As Gregory had hoped, Ricker's European experiences influenced him in his approach to education. Upon Ricker's return to fall in 1873, he became the permanent instructor for the architecture program, where he was the only and primary architectural instructor until 1851. So he taught everyone every course from 1873 to 1891. Within the first year of his position, he had revised the curriculum. In addition to administration and teaching duties, remember he's also becoming dean at this time, Ricker designed buildings for the expanding campus. From Ricker's accounting, even as a student, he used his skills in the wood shop to improve campus conditions. And this type of contribution increased after he became an instructor. And so this is the chemistry building under construction. You might recognize it now as Harker Hall. So Ricker designed the chemistry building in 1875 and it was constructed in 1877, but significant growth in the campus came in the 1890s after a decade of financial difficulties. And this is where Ricker's larger contribution to the physical development of the university occurred. Prior to the start of the 90s, there were three main buildings on campus: University Hall, a mechanical building and drill hall, and then Ricker's new chemical laboratory. A new drill hall was built in 1890 to relocate the military practices and increase the space for practical use. The design of the new drill hall was sparse, efficient, and without heat, but the metal trusses allowed for uninterrupted space of 100 by 150 feet. The Natural History Building, it was also Ricker, was next to be completed. So he designed that building and these two buildings. However, he was also submitting program requirements for three additional buildings: the Engineering Building, the Library Building, and the Natural History Museum. 38 designs were submitted for the library, right? And as you may, if you know architecture names, Daniel H. Burnham interviewed for this position, and there was an understanding reached with him. He designed the Rickery in Chicago and was one of the leads in the 1893 World's Fair. Burnham presented two designs. One was a Tudor Gothic, and one was a Grecian or Classic. And the Board of Trustees chose one, and the Governor Altgeld chose the other. So seeing the difficulties ahead, Burnham stepped down and resigned from this commission. The university still needed a library, and both governor and trustees turned once again to the School of Architecture for a solution. 2 months later, Ricker, in partnership with James M. White, our second faculty member, presented drawings to Governor Altgeld, and the Romanesque design is accepted and is today's Altgeld Hall. With their design, Ricker and White incorporated technical innovations in their design, such as concrete slab that provided the fireproof construction rather than a hollow tile floor system. In February 1896, the contract specified that while the two primary architectural instructors were to be employed for this project, the quality of architectural education must not suffer. So this was never likely to be the case with Ricker. Ricker had a clever solution in that he employed students and graduates in the design and construction of the building. In 1897, the library building opened, and as Ricker described, with the sole exception of the mosaics in the entrance hall, the entire work is a product of the Department of Architecture. The building was dedicated in 1897, and shortly after, Ricker was asked to be removed from the campus projects so that he could return to other duties. As evident from his background, Ricker knew the importance of construction in the creation of architecture. Here he is in the center, what we think is one of the first classes there. He designed important buildings, as we saw, and he supervised their construction. Prior to his entry to the university, right, he built buildings, fixed wagons, and had his own carpentry skills. So the positives of these experiences and his long trip to Europe influenced the way that he was going to develop the curriculum. One thing to note is that he had an affinity with the German education style, the Bau Academy, but a rejection of the French, the École des Beaux-Arts. He felt that was more in keeping with what the students in the West needed. And in 1910, addressed to the Illinois chapter of American Institute of Architects, Ricker acknowledged that most architectural schools in the country, and so in 1910 there were about 30 schools, were following the Beaux-Arts model of education. The University of Illinois, under Ricker's leadership, had been different, and undeniably the curriculum and model followed his professional judgment. He believed that one had to learn the elements of a building before having advanced skills of architectural design. Talented architecture designers were few, and a public, state university had to train students to enter the entire architecture profession. Construction knowledge was essential not only to protect public safety, but the integrity of the profession. As an educator, Ricker thought it was his responsibility to implement these values. While the courses themselves are evidence of what Ricker deemed important, so were his written descriptions of the program to future students. The beginning curriculum identified the program's objective, and paraphrasing the first one, was a full and thorough knowledge of the scientific principles of construction. Of note is the emphasis of the word scientific, which reflected the growing belief in the power of science and its place in the university system. Ricker's emphasis on science has also been supported by University Regent John Milton Gregory's vision for the university, where he saw the new era of science was to enlighten the industrial classes. The second focus would be recognized in any architectural school today. We want a thorough knowledge and skills of the profession, such as drawing, specification, estimates, design, and drawing abilities. And the third objective was a practical knowledge of construction in all forms by a full course of shop practice, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. With shop practice came familiarity with trades and their skills. Additionally, for Ricker, construction materials and methods were of a place, and the knowledge could lead to what he saw as an American architecture. So if If you think back, this is when we're getting in the period of a lot of revivals, and so we're yet to define what an American architecture looks like. And so he thought this type of knowledge could benefit the state, the growing state, and the profession. So underlying this is that Ricker believed that he served the university, the state of Illinois, and the students themselves. Ricker was rather plain-spoken on the subject and noted that it was his responsibility to train all of his students for a career. The students from Illinois, he observed, came with backgrounds that had not prepared them adequately for a university education, and while the top and a small number of students would go on to be architectural designers, most would not. Under his leadership, the school trained students with skills that allowed them to be architects, as well as other specializations within architecture, including construction, office assistants, and those that designed building systems. The state, he said, had a right to demand proper training of their sons and daughters, and the students deserved training to some useful purpose. Knowledge of construction, structure, and heating and ventilation systems provided that background. Interestingly, Ricker reported to the Board of Trustees, and this is in writing, that one of his reasons around this education was that the training would give the students a means of honestly earning a living, or that he may do work which is often required about a residence of a farm, should reverses in life occur. Right? So should you get your degree and things go bad, you can go back and still be useful. Right? And so he's reflecting on the sentiment of the backgrounds of his students at the time, which were very practical and wanted immediate practical applications. Simultaneously, Ricker saw that to be trained technically from an architectural perspective would benefit what's being created. He also noted, remember he's dean of the College of Engineering, that engineers had no training for buildings. An architect had no choice but to learn the technical. Ricker's guiding principles led him to instill construction, structures, and materials as defining characteristics of the architectural education at the University of Illinois. Besides being able to draw a detail for every portion, Ricker suggested that beauty can be found in the systems too, and all the systems contribute to the building design. So other institutions provide further insight into the distinction of the program at Illinois and Ricker's contribution. By 1888, there were 6 schools of architecture. The first 5 schools were established programs, and architectural education was in its second decade. Though apprenticeship remained, university education of architects was more readily acknowledged as the new standard. As the periodical American Architect and Building News declared, the advantages of school training for architects have become generally appreciated, and that time is quite right for the university to take position that its graduates must be thoroughly equipped to rise to the highest positions of the profession. In that same year, 1888, the American Architect and Building News ran a series of articles about architectural education in the United States, and they analyzed MIT, Illinois, Cornell, and Columbia, and provided details that cannot be found in curricular descriptions. The programs at MIT, Columbia, and Syracuse incorporated trips to buildings under construction or access to professional or offices. Ricker lamented that students in Illinois did not have access to construction of first-class city buildings, meaning Chicago buildings, I believe, and thus the character of the program had to be different. Architecture had to come to the university through the instructor, through images and books. The knowledge of science was an important component of the practice of architecture, which is incorporated into each one of the 5 programs, including Syracuse. Strength of materials, mechanics, roof structures, heating, and ventilation were addressed in all of these schools in some degree. Illinois was different from the other schools in both the numbers of hours dedicated to construction instruction and the requirement of shop practice. So here's my summary of these hours that they asked each one to have. And so the series of articles, again, analyzed these 3 schools and hours for each curriculum. And for the theory of construction, Illinois was nearly 3 times that of the other 2 schools. Yet Ricker's intentions were clear, and the program in Illinois differed from the others based on these intentions. As he stated to the AIA, the American Institute of Architects Committee in Education, in 1887, a great mistake is often made by instructors in requiring so-called original designs from pupils who've never absorbed any ideas of form or detail to work up, with the sole result of permanently disabling the originating powers of the student. They wish him to run before he's learned to stand alone. Additionally, no other school than Illinois required shop practice. The series of articles specifically asked this of each school, and the responses were a similar thread. Shop practice was the practice of construction, and architects only needed to know the theory of it. Ricker, on the other hand, wanted his students to be exposed to the practice so they could better understand the theory and construction of buildings. So this is a description of the shop practices. So shop practice of Illinois eventually evolved into 3-course sequence in the first year of the architecture student's education. The first course addressed carpentry and joinery, the second turning and cabinet making, and the third built portions of a building at a smaller scale and included metal, stone, and plaster. The intention behind the 350 hours of coursework was to allow the students to deeply explore a trade and material. Ricker realized it was not appropriate nor possible for architects to become fully skilled in one trade or another. However, he intended learning one trade should provide a framework in which to learn the other. So he's teaching you how to learn about a material. The shop classes yielded insights that could only be achieved by making an object with the proper tools and materials. Assignments were repeated until thoroughly completed. It was a learning process designed to refine the student's ability to conceive and analyze what could be built. Though he experimented with how shop classes were taught, Ricker started and returned with the Russian method of instruction that he had witnessed at the 1873 World's Fair. So this method of instruction can be traced, interestingly, to Victor Delavasse, and he was the director of the Empirical Technical School in Moscow, where he began teaching this pedagogy in 1868. The methods of teaching mechanical arts was exhibited in St. Petersburg in 1870 and then introduced across Russia. It was featured in the 1873 Vienna's World Fair, where Ricker experienced it, and then it was displayed on American audiences in the 1876 Centennial in Philadelphia, where it gained a wider viewing and adoption within the United States. Delavasse was influenced by his time in Paris, where he attended the schools at the École Centrale, and where he actually labored in a French factory in order to study the system. Through his experiences abroad and home, Delavasse recognized that there were inefficiencies in apprenticeships and deficiencies in the polytechnic models he had witnessed. The École Centrale educated engineers and industry leaders in the industrial sciences, but Delavasse wanted to educate mechanical contractors as well as mechanical engineers. Both models were intended to reshape society around that time, and the École Centrale was seeking a new type of intellectual that could use science for the betterment of humanity. And Delavasse's Imperial Technical College was shaping an expansive class of individuals to be more broadly educated and adept. So rather than becoming an expert in just brick, you would become an expert in multiple techniques. Delavasse insisted that his students have practical knowledge with their hands, and through this practical knowledge, was taught with scientific means. The novelty in the Russian system was that the system could use mechanical skills that could be transformed into knowledge into a pedagogy that decreased the time to learn the subject and increased the breadth of the worker. Ricker's pedagogical intentions were similar in that he was teaching a range of students with various professional inclinations, and he wanted the students to be prepared. Ricker recognized that architects would need practical knowledge as a foundation. Whether based on his own experience with the material, the need in architecture, or the ease of setting up a shop, Ricker chose to use wood as the exemplar material. Ricker noted that his contribution to this method was that students would build work from drawings. Students would have to understand directions as they gave the contractor through their own drawings, reinforcing the importance of their own work. As Ricker stated, students would get a clear idea of the connection of the drawings to the actual work. So also amazingly, 40 assignments from the shop classes exist today. And so we have 40 assignments for the first and second term. For the first term, we have almost a complete set of assignments 1 through 25. This is the first assignment here, and most appear to be in Ricker's hands. The first assignment for the first term was planing a flat surface. In addition to figures, students were given instructions about which tools to use and in which order. In the second term, students built Gothic paneling and ornamental turning, such as a newel post cap. I knew I'd do that. The exercises in the last term, the latter half of the second term, don't exist, but would expect it to be like a scaled stairs or a construction of a wooden roof, as well as plaster work in place of stone. The year of shop practice would, as the Russian pedagogy prescribed, lead the students from an introduction to a tool to its full use and application of it. Ricker's course of shop practice was taught from 1873 to 1894 in conjunction with Ricker's construction classes. And there's the new post there. So the types of buildings required for growing Illinois reinforce the emphasis of a technical nature. And Ricker's emphasis on construction can be seen through the courses that he set up. He also invited practitioners from Chicago to visit the campus, and share the latest advancement of what's going on in Chicago. So Dankmar Adler of Adler and Sullivan came, William LeBaron Jenney, one of the earliest designers of skyscrapers, came, and so did Daniel H. Burnham, and came and gave lectures to students. The practical knowledge from architecture found resonance with the building owners and students seeking immediate and applicable knowledge. Construction education suited the program at the University of Illinois, making it relevant to local industries and communities. Ricker's emphasis on construction can be seen in the order and number of classes. After completing the first year and the 3 required shop classes, they took a year of construction courses alongside drawing and watercolor. And by the time the students had reached the final year of the architectural curriculum, they had studied materials through making and shaping, the theory of construction and materials, the history of architecture, and the tools to communicate. In other words, the students had learned the components that they could be then synthesized in their final year of design. This is the 1888-1889 program, and it gave you a clear idea of what materials were studied when. Students were taught by lecture, textbook, models, sketches, and later photographs. Here is an image of one of the assignments from the student work, and you can see they're just learning how to draw, scale, and build an arch here. And the assignments, the students had to combine their practical experiences obtained in shop practice with the theory of the best construction methods, as well as the science behind them. He had created a methodological as well as intellectual framework for construction learning. Tools, materials, processes, and the theories behind them were spelled out for the students who came without much construction knowledge and little access to building sites. So, turning to this, and to aid students' learning, he composed a textbook called The Elements of Construction in 2 volumes. And you can see the note, and somebody put it on top. Look, we found this. This is one of the things he used all the time. Architecture schools were few in 1875, and architecture's textbooks were fewer. The Element of Construction, his unpublished textbook for the coursework, represents Ricker's educational philosophy and reflects his educational influence on architecture. The Elements of Construction existed in 2 volumes, but was always an evolving work. The first volume, we can see images from it here, addressed strength of materials and wood, including material selection, joinery, tools, stairs, and topics that had been directly addressed in shop practice. The second volume included foundations, stone and masonry, brick, tile, and terracotta, and iron and steel construction. The second volume was much more expansive in construction materials and methods, and the technology and conceptual innovations were reshaping the cities as they were being defined themselves. And this is especially true in Chicago in the late 19th century, right? The ubiquitous steel frame construction had not yet been established or fully understood when Ricker wrote this book, but the pathways for reconceptualization of the building structure, building skins, building heights, and interior spaces had begun. 3 projects within this second volume help us date this version of the existing textbook. Images including here are William LeBaron Jenney's Fair Building, which opened in 1892, the engineering building on campus, which was dedicated in 1894, and the Manhattan Life Insurance Building in 1894. Thus, this gives us an approximate date of 1894, so the end of the use of this. The date of the text meant that the subjects addressed covered numerous topics, including some that would fade away. And so at this time, cast iron is starting to fade away, and steel is coming in. So he tried to look backwards and forwards at the same time. He presented multiple types of foundations, and he was intended to train architects to work both in rural areas as well as important buildings in a city. And it reflects the remarkable moment in construction technology at the time where knowledge is still being tested and developed. This book was distributed to students, and you can notice the blue images here, through the blue process or blueprinting. So a university document dated about 1881 described this process as being used on campus in the beginning of the summer of 1878 and the early adoption of architecture and other units. So this is a negative of one of those sheets. The negatives for these sheets were composed on trace paper with ink or black, sometimes typed in black ink. These pages were then printed by setting a negative on top of a page and letting it sit in the sun for 2 to 3 minutes at a time. For the 1884 and 1885 school year, 30,000 pages were blueprinted for the University of Illinois and included departments as architecture, zoology, and military science. So he analyzed this process, which was amazing in itself, and used the education in a thorough fashion. He said a lecture no longer had to be burdened by the limit of time in a lecture, but could be just the contents on the sheet. He said it was pure dictation of notes by professors to the students was medieval now that we had more books and more information. An additional benefit to the lectures was that these could be updated annually. So they could be, quote unquote, fresh and abreast with the progress of science including the latest construction detail or translation of scientific work. Ricker's translated over 40 books in multiple languages. The Blue process allowed students to gain the latest information and keep up with the speed of changes that are happening in the construction industry. The sources for this information were timely and relevant to their current practices, but it also meant that these books were never published. If they published them, they would be too static. And so he's literally changing out pages and blueprinting and putting them back in. The subject of the second volume, with the divisions listed here, and each material is defined and indicated in a manner. He concludes the subtypes of the material, as well as giving guidance on how it should be used. The connection of joining and joining the material was used, as well as mortars, types of cement, for example. He listed the why, what, how, and so what for each material for his architectural students. The plates accompanied the material demonstrated stone cutting, stone masonry cut forms, brick coursing, iron and steel forms, with several images on each plate. Just as the text could be supplemented with as technology changes, so could the images. So several plates were inserted. You see that this is 12B here, and so this is showing a later 19th century method of fireproofing and supporting floors. And Ricker found success in this, and he continued, and this textbook continued to be used until 1898, when it was placed by Kidder's Building Construction and Superintendents. The volume 2, which is what this is from, of Elements Construction, is remarkable in that it encapsulates how buildings were built and at the same time provides a value of what was important in the education of the architect in the 19th century. Ricker's influence was not limited to his students, and here we have what was sort of known as the first skyscraper in Chicago, so this is happening as Ricker is teaching. In the 1880s brought an increase in the number and complexity of buildings in Chicago. Construction and material innovations were ubiquitous, and the common use of blueprinting was used to do drawings. And so no longer did we need someone who could draw, we needed someone skilled in the profession. Architectural training provided a greater number of practitioners, but it needed to be rigorous. So beyond the intellectual ability, there was a need to ensure that those calling themselves architects had sufficient knowledge and can be distinguished from the hucksters selling themselves as architects of the day, which was something that Ricker lamented. Ricker saw this as a challenge to the profession of architecture and to public safety. The lack of construction knowledge was not only dangerous, literally dangerous, as parts of buildings were falling off in Chicago, but it diminished the standing of the architect in the public's eye, which is something that he was very much concerned about. So thus, it was only natural that when a licensing law for architects was proposed in Illinois in 1890s, Ricker supported it and was willing to enforce it. So here we have the very first Illinois Board of Examiners of Architects. And so that Illinois was the first state in the nation to enact a licensing law for architects and also structural engineers. But in architects, it was July 1897. Among requirements were examinations and sealed drawings, which is something very familiar in practice today. But they also required an Illinois State Board of Examiners of Architects. The board was to be comprised of 5 individuals with either 10 years of practice experience or to belong to the faculty of University of Illinois. Inland Architect, a very famous journal at the time, called for men of undoubted integrity and most esteemed for designing and structural knowledge. You can see Ricker on your far right, and Dinkmar Adler is in the center. He led the licensing effort. We also have William Reeves, William Zimmerman, and P.B. White on the very first board of the Examiners of Architects. Ricker served on this board for 20 years, but most of the times he served as chair. And his influence can actually be seen in the legislation, so requiring an Illinois faculty member on the board. And miraculously, Ricker's graduates were excluded from examinations on construction, sanitation, and strength of materials, which was most of the first day of the exam. So additionally, Ricker's emphasis on thorough knowledge in building constructions would be tested in the licensing exam. So either he taught you it in school, or you had to learn it for the licensing exam. And so undoubtedly, we know that the exam happened in Chicago. It also was hosted on the campus. We know we gave exams on the campus. And so undoubtedly, while we don't have direct evidence, we can assume that he helped write those questions. Right? So licensing and examination based on the skills in construction went a long way to ensuring that architects would have the knowledge needed to design and build buildings safely. He did not say, he himself acknowledged not necessarily a great building itself, but it wouldn't fall down. Right, so he acknowledged that architects would have their own taste and do things that way. Ricker thus had created a structure to educate students in the construction and found a way to reinforce this knowledge in the professional base in Illinois. So, reflecting on the career of Ricker, Ricker's constant desire to shape the discipline of architecture, but along that, he had a desire for the evolution of American architecture, and he sought this even as a student. And so this is in 1871. I didn't even know this existed until I started this. This is the very first student newspaper in the University of Illinois. And so here we see volume 1, number 1, and Ricker and his fellow student, M.F. Hatch, had a regular column in this newspaper, and this one in particular called American Architecture. And Ricker and Hatch argued for the need for an American style. However, before that could be developed, the American style had to be supported by the American people and the arousing of native good taste. So he's writing this as a student, right? And so the article provides a list of what was needed. And the first requirement was a Central School of Architects, which, remember, the AIA was talking about this. And of course, knowledge of the École Beaux-Arts and the Bau Academy exists. That Central School of Architects was never realized in the United States. They also called for a journal on architecture to rival the Van Nostrand's engineering magazine. And this new journal and proposed architectural journal would contain not only the history of art, but articles explaining construction, workshop practices, and methods. The American style, they believed, could come about when the public inherently understood construction in the design of their buildings. American buildings were to be made of materials and techniques locally available with local labor and local resources. So how could a style be developed without the adoption of this knowledge? The third and last thing that both Hatch and Ricker thought was needed was a series of books for each trade containing full direction and the necessary instructions and explanations for executing all kinds of buildings in the best manner, giving the methods actually used in various parts of the country, right? So these books would include plans, sketches, strength of materials, proportioning, proper use and management of materials. And in 1871, Ricker and Hatch indicated that such works did not exist, but only books that were too general, too full of product advertisements, or too theoretical. Such a series of books, they insisted, would elevate architecture to its rightful place in the highest of all arts. So they're writing this in 1871. Ricker becomes an instructor in 1873. So it's only 2 years later, after the completion of his degree and exploration of education systems, Ricker begins to implement the education that he desired, right? And begins to write his lectures on the element of construction. And so we can see that this elements of construction is a manifestation of Ricker's intended book series that he had hoped for as a student. So reflecting on Ricker and Hatch's column, 2 questions are being asked. What does it mean to have an architecture created from the systems unique to the United States, and how is this information communicated? In other words, how can the basics of architecture construction be disseminated and used to define and solidify an architecture that was characteristically American? In an era where Ricker practice was full of uncertainty, there was development, there was looking backwards, there was looking forward, there's a lack of standards. There's no standards, there's no building standards here. So there's no, like we have some codes, but there's no building standards. And constant change. And so the first question started to be answered as the tall buildings rose from the flatlands of Chicago. So we know between 1882 and 1893, we figure out steel frame construction. It is the moment in Chicago when all of these buildings happen, right? We know economic and use needs in the business district in both Chicago and New York helped shape our understanding of these buildings. American architects and engineers refined these technologies and the aesthetics together, and we have examples of, you might think of the Reliance building in Chicago with its large plate glass windows, replacing these dark facades. We have terracotta panels, of course, Louis Sullivan, and then reduction and ornamentation leading to what is called the commercial style. The technologies, while not fixed, they were settling into place. And so the second question, as Ricker would discover, was much more difficult, even for those in the field of architecture. Construction technologies must first be acknowledged as central to the training of architects, which was not and might argue today is still not the basis of that. Better construction meant better buildings. Better constructions led to more a trusted and ethical profession. More importantly, better construction knowledge enabled what Ricker thought was better design choices, as the architect could unify the parts into a whole. The method and building types produced in the United States would have their own language based on their own construction. In Ricker's terms, buildings must have good and honest construction, utilizing materials in their own sense and not being used to hide or conceal design defects. This would allow architecture to develop not as an imitation, but with originality, and an American architecture to be created. As Ricker observed, a great and distinct American style can only be produced by the method of evolution in accordance with our materials, construction, requirements. This method has been thoroughly successful in the case of the American house, right? And the office building, and with equally so, the new type of commercial architecture recently originated in Chicago. Seeing that his view was not universally accepted, right, and we see that in the number of hours that he's teaching construction versus the other ones that are, Ricker insisted that this subject was learned in rigorous architectural education, right, his testing, or testing through architectural examination, ensuring that others saw the importance of construction. The 1871 article shows that Ricker notably sketched out the need for construction education as a student and set the standard he would spend his entire life implementing. Ricker's volumes of element in construction illustrate his rigor, attention to detail, and his knowledge of contemporary architectural practices. What is happening in Chicago is certainly coming to our campus at that time. These volumes, like his pedagogy, are evidence of Ricker's leadership in architectural education and the architectural profession. How a building is built was essential to public safety, more important, essential to the essence of architecture. Ricker led Illinois students through a rigorous and systematic education featuring construction. Students from the farm fields of Illinois could design important buildings in architecture. When Ricker started teaching, architecture in the United States was still determining its values. By the time Ricker retired in 1916, construction educations were in the form we would recognize today. Ricker's endeavors led to 80% of his graduates entering the business industry, setting the foundation for architectural education, and at the same time setting the foundation of architectural education that would resonate at our school as architecture 150 years later. Henry Bacon, the designer of the Lincoln Memorial in D.C., and whose only architectural education was at the University of Illinois, reflected on Ricker's influence in a letter for Ricker's 50th anniversary with the university in 1922. Bacon noted that Ricker had a long and distinguished career, but most importantly, he congratulated Ricker for being a bearer of light to those who followed. So as I wrap up here, I want to say a little bit about the book. So the book is published by the University of Illinois Press, and it contains some of the stories that I've been sharing here. It contains the images as well. And then there are several chapters that contextualize what's happening here. Also, Ricker's textbook is reproduced in this book. So the first half is chapters that are contextualizing Ricker and what's happening in Chicago, right? And then the second half is Ricker's textbook. So it's actually published. And so the chapters here address the context in Chicago, architectural publishing at the time, and each chapter, there's also additional chapters that address each material section. So for foundations, Leslie highlights the growing and uncertain knowledge around foundations at the time. We had buildings that were falling over because their foundations weren't correct. For masonry, Will identifies Ricker's desire to have standards. Ricker's telling you how to sound out materials. And some of those standards for masonry we can find actually in later standards that were produced in with masonry later. And for steel, Friedman identifies the time capsule nature of these chapters. And so he says he can identify portions that were written in the 1870s and some in the 1880s. And so in addition to the Ricker stories and the Ricker textbook, these chapters are amazing contribution on their own. And so there are bookmarks by the chair, and so if you're interested in this or if you just want a bookmark to remember tonight, please grab one as you go. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marci. If there are any questions at all, we can have those addressed now.
Yes.
How many buildings did he design?
He designed 5 buildings on campus. Okay. Yes. But he was...
How many are still up?
4.
That is so amazing.
So 5. Let's see. Natural history, Harker Hall, the Drill Hall Annex, Altgeld. Yeah, and I think one of them.
Was the wood
What?
shop?
Engineering Hall.
He did not design engineering
Did
hall.
not do that.
No, engineering hall was designed by an architecture graduate. They put in the competition that it must be one of our graduates, and he helped select that graduate. Yes.
Was the wood shop a Ricker?
So the wood shops, he ran the wood shop as a student, and then continued on. And then because architecture was using it so much, he continued it on. But mechanical engineering at the time had their own shop, so there was lots of shop practices going on, and so that was happening. Yes.
I saw in your presentation you used one slide of students' architecture drawing.
Yes.
Do you know what does the School of Architecture collects those students' faculty drawings? When I first came to your university 30 years ago, I went to an old architecture building in the basement full of the architecture drawings over 100 years.
Yes, I have really good news on that. And so,
They were in terrible condition.
yes, and I have good news. I have good news. I wrote a National Endowment Humanities grant, and it got funded, and we moved all of those drawings to the University Archives. And so we bought-
archives, not
Yeah,
the
yeah,
school
right.
archives.
And so the kind of the rule in collecting things is if they're not cataloged, they don't exist. And so we got a grant, we got folders, we got help. They're all cataloged now. They're all in the University Archives. If you go on the University Archives website, you'll see a finding aid just for student drawings,
Mhm.
and then you could go and request to see any of those drawings at any point now.
Okay. that's
Thank
good.
you for doing that, that's excellent.
We did lose some drawings, but we have a collection. We have Ricker's drawings. We have the one I showed of the vaulting. We have volumes of student drawings of that time, during that time, and then we have what was curated within the architecture department from roughly the 1880s to 1985 in the archives now. Yes. Go ahead.
In response to the gentleman's question, my understanding is that the wood shop and foundry was designed by another protege of Ricker's, where he had strong influence, but he was not the designer.
I don't know that he was the designer. He did supervise.
He was not the designer.
Yeah, so he supervised it. So
Yeah.
so Ricker as a student ran the wood shop,
Right.
and then he supervised it. And
Right.
Spencer, I'm forgetting Spencer's first name. Spencer also designed Noise, I believe. Spencer was one of his students, and Spencer ran that wood shop for years. And the indication of the closeness between Spencer and Ricker, Spencer's name is on one of the student assignments they showed, but Spencer named his children after Ricker's wife and Ricker's daughter.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
But immediately adjacent to the wood shop was another building, later on known as Aero Lab
Yeah.
B.
Oh, forgot about
It
that.
was also a metal shop, and it was a shop that was utilized by the university to fabricate
Yes.
a lot of materials used in construction. That was a Ricker building.
Right. That was the one that was torn
Yeah.
down. Yes.
Yeah, and that one was torn down also to
Right.
make way for the engineering quad.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether, I know that Ricker had his hand in the design of the electrical engineering
Could be.
building, the first electrical engineering building there, and also in the women's gym that was immediately adjacent to
Sure.
it. But I don't know that he designed either of those. Do you?
No, I don't think that he did, but he was an acting campus architect for a long time, and so they would come to him and he would write programs for them. He would help ensure that they get built correctly. He would help ensure that he hired the right architects. So for the Alka El Tal, they originally held a competition, and Ricker and White and someone else selected the winner, and then they found out that this person had never built a building before, and so they threw it out. And then went to Burnham, and then Burnham said, "Okay, let's try it." And then when the board of trustees and the governor disagreed, he was like, "Peace out," right? And so that's how Ricker got it.
What I also wanted to ask though
Yeah.
was this: there are a lot of buildings that exist locally and elsewhere throughout the state and nation that were designed by that first generation of students who were
Yes.
educated directly by Ricker.
Yes,
There's a lot of beauties right here in this town.
for sure. Yeah.
And has anyone ever gone through and photographed, made a list of, and discussed the influence that he had directly in this field?
No.
We're about to lose one of those buildings here very soon.
Yeah, not to my
It was
knowledge.
designed by one of his students.
Yeah.
Which building?
University Place Christian Church.
Oh.
Yeah.
That was designed by George Ramey, who also designed the current city building and the original part of what is now Champaign Central High School, and along with other buildings. He also, by the way, supervised the construction of the Virginia Theater when it was
Interesting.
going on.
Yeah, so no, and that's,
So
that's,
and then that's not to mention, Joseph Royer from
Yes.
Urbana, who
Yes.
has designed just a tremendous amount of buildings here that we all are familiar with. And again, he was another first generation
yes.
Ricker student.
Yes, no, and that work is yet to be done. We know that, I'll never forget this, we know that several of his students became university architects. James White became a university architect. We know it was University of Wisconsin, there was a university architect. We know that one of his students designed YMCA's all over the world. We have, and so that has, and there was a group of people called Ricker's Boys who have not been able to trace who they were exactly, but we know they're working in Burnham's office in Chicago. We know that they're, Clarence Backall, who did Follinger Hall, did the very first steel building in Boston, which was one of Ricker's early students, right? So we know that this is happening. Very early on, we had a Japanese student, and he went back to Japan and became an instructor at the Imperial College there. So we have the list of these students. We don't have the work that's been all traced with him. Interestingly, so Ricker, 1873 to 1916. 1910 to 1913, we get Frederick Mann as the director of the school. He comes in, wants to do Beaux-Arts, wants to make sure no women get any education. He's gone by 1913, and Loring Provine takes over. Loring Provine is one of Ricker's students. Loring Provine is the director from 1913 to 1948, and is on the faculty maybe into the 1970s. And then Rex Newcomb, becomes the very first dean of the College of Fine Applied Arts in 1932. He was one of Ricker's students. And Ricker's favorite subject, even though it's an emphasis in construction here, Ricker's favorite subject was history. Newcomb studied history with Ricker, then went out to USC, and he was one of the first American history architects known to do specialization. He specialized in the missions. And then he came back and was the dean of the very first dean of College of Fine Arts from like 1932, roughly, to 1960. So if you think of Ricker starting in 1870, people he directly influenced were involved in the college into the 1960s. So almost 100 years. And so there's lots and lots of things to chase here. There have been a lot of articles about Ricker, but very few books. And so I'm very happy to show you this one here. Yes, sir.
Was the University Hall designed by an architecture school here?
I do not believe so.
Okay. Yeah, University Hall was the first building designed and built by university.
Yes. Yeah.
And opened 1875.
Yes.
Or started.
Yes.
Replaced its first building.
Yes.
Donated by local. So it wasn't designed by architecture school here.
No, I do not believe so. But
Yeah.
yeah. Yes.
I have the name of
Yes, but
two people,
right.
but I forgot. But,
Yeah. Yeah.
And what year did you say he was the only person teaching?
1873 to 1891, and White joins him in 1891, and White eventually becomes the campus architect, in addition to teaching. Yeah, but you really kind of wonder how he did all that he did. He's translating 40 books. He's traveling back and forth to Chicago so he can sit on these committees. And travel back then was a little different, right? And he's creating thousands, I don't know, I think pages and pages of text that he's using to teach these students. He's running the College of Engineering. He's building buildings. He's overseeing the buildings of other buildings. I don't know how you can possibly do all of that.
And he had a family as well?
He did. So he married Mary Steele, who was I think an 1875 graduate, and he had a daughter named Ethel. Ethel graduated from the architecture program. Ricker was agnostic on women, but eventually about 1910, he's like, yeah, they work harder. So And Ethel actually drew some of the illustrations from some of his formerly published books. But I'm not convinced that was a good relationship for all. Mary Steele died very tragically, and as soon as Ricker died, Ethel was out. She was like, I'm not, she's gone. She moves to Chicago. And there's a letter from the university writing to her saying, do you have anything for Ricker for us? And she's like, here, have $500 and go away. Yeah, so really I think his life was the school, and everybody else sort of tagged along. But I have also seen letters about Ricker at other institutions. So the University of Pennsylvania in their archives, at some point everybody's looking for architectural engineers, and U of I is the very first architectural engineering program in the country, and what Ricker meant by that was people who designed engineering systems for buildings, right? He saw engineers come do that, and so somebody's writing layered out in Pennsylvania, and he said, well, if Ricker says it's so, then it's so. Right, and so Ricker has a national reputation of being a straight shooter. And White did not necessarily. So, yes?
I was curious, does anyone know what happened to the research that one of the preservation architects here at the university did on Ricker? This is David Garner.
Oh yeah, it's in the archives. You can go and take a look at that. Yeah. And he's the one, he has contemporary, was contemporary versions of Ricker's houses. So he went to Maine and photographed some of those. But yeah, that's all there. So.
If I remember correctly, Dave was one of the people that helped restore Ricker's house.
Yes, he was. Dave was instrumental behind that. He was also instrumental in, he was the person actually who found the archway to University Hall, which
Oh,
later
cool.
became the Gateway Arch.
Yeah.
And Dave did a tremendous amount on this campus.
Wait,
Yeah.
does everybody know where his house is on Green Street?
I think it's on the corner of Kohler.
Yeah,
It's got sort of a
It's-
semi-wraparound porch.
it's on the northeast
Yeah.
corner.
Yeah.
Okay, northeast corner of Green and Kohler.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's a
that's right
White
there.
House. Yeah.
Okay.
Right next to the Presbyterian Church.
Okay.
Any other questions we have for Professor Uhlein?
Yes.
I just Google checked, says University Hall was designed and built by Ricker and James White.
University Hall? I don't think so.
Yeah, that's what the Google says, but.
Well, yeah, but, we don't always believe Google.
Yeah,
Right.
but.
James White was a student in the 1880s. What year was 18? He couldn't have possibly designed the
Yeah,
university.
but the early research, they said the University Hall was like a Altigale building.
Oh, no, the library was Alkel.
Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, so Alkel building was certainly designed by Ricker and James White, for sure.
Okay, so maybe this, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I think university published the early architecture, or 100 years of university architecture. University Hall
Yeah,
was
yeah.
in it, and there was information about who designed it.
So, and the other thing, so that was John French was a co-author of that, but also if you look at mapping history at the University of Illinois,
Mhm.
you will see some architectural history there, as well as some of my students did models, replicas and models that of these buildings during those times, and so you can take a look there.
Yeah, and all University Hall was demolished for Atlanta Union
Yes,
building.
yes.
But another school in the United States liked the building and commissioned.
Yes, that's the
one.
University of Arkansas, and you can go see it, you can go
They're
see
still
it.
using it, right?
Yeah, you can go see it on that campus, yeah.
that's
So that building eventually became known as the White Elephant, and I think it was
Mhm.
destroyed by, Ricker has an article about how the tornado hit it, and it was
Mhm.
destroyed after that.
Well, the elephant was over on University Avenue.
Oh, you're right, you're right, yeah.
I get those two things.
Yeah, you're right.
Any other questions?
I think you're gonna write an article for the paper, because more people need to hear about this. This is so interesting.
Yeah, this
Please,
is great.
Please write an article for the paper.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, let's give Professor Uhlein one more hand.
Thank you for coming out and seeing us.
Oh, this is excellent.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming tonight for our history talk at the Champaign County History Museum. If you enjoyed this one, we've got more up next for you. In September, we are going to be having a new author, Erin Nieto, who is going to be talking about her publication about the romance between a professor at the University of Illinois and a professor at the University of Chicago during the Manhattan Project by exploring their love letters to each other and correspondence.
Fascinating.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you.